We are in the middle of a momentous digital transformation process. This process started many years ago, but it has accelerated significantly. In just a few months' time, the COVID-19 crisis has brought about years of change in the way companies in all sectors and regions do business. Many executives now acknowledge the strategic importance of technology as a critical component of the business. For internal processes such as back office, R&D processes and production, but also to the customer-facing elements. Digital transformation is no longer just a competitive edge. It is critical for business resilience. Consumers have moved dramatically towards online channels, and companies and industries have responded in turn. We have seen its impact on personal interactions. We travel less, but have more web meetings. Many of us might have experienced many different web meeting platforms. We also see it on online banking. Online banking was never as relevant to us as it is now, and as well on e-commerce. With 30%, the e-commerce market grew faster than before. Not a surprise, given that many brick and mortar shops needed to close for many weeks because of the pandemic. But with 13% of credit card online payments not being completed, we realize that card abandonment is still impacting business in a significant manner. We learned that authentication friction in general is a major factor for card abandonment. This becomes obvious given that online authentication is at the core of all online transactions. That authentication is a front door to digital services in general. We and many others expect that a good part of this change in behavior will remain, even after the pandemic. Surveys have shown that more than 2/3 of the consumers that have tried new shopping behavior have the intent to continue that. The trend towards online shopping seems to be one of the more permanent changes. Often the main driver for the change in behavior was less the health concern, but more convenience and time savings. And these reasons remain even when the pandemic ends. The flip side is that online fraud grew significantly as well. Fraud loss volume increased by 87% and the fraud rate by even 100%, meaning attackers are more focusing on this type of fraud now. Two things are really surprising to me here. First, that the fraud volume, meaning the money that was lost, and the attempt rate grow almost at the same rate. And second, that fraud volume grew even more than the e-commerce market itself. What it tells me is that legacy solutions are not very effective. If attackers try, they can almost linearly scale their fraud business. Essentially meaning we need more effective security for protecting online business. Or in other words, there is a need for robust security, a level of security that prevents scalable attacks. This is a way how adding more security was imagined in the past, layering different authentication methods on top of each other, resulting in many steps users would have to go through, and each step adding some incremental level of friction. But we know that users will find workarounds if the secure way provides too much friction. And we know that it will be difficult to convince service providers to implement methods requiring unnecessary friction, as this will negatively impact their business. Since some years, Knock Knock and the FIDO Alliance are working on a more effective way for addressing online authentication. A way that is radically different from legacy approaches, a way that combines more security with more convenience, a combination that is really rare. Our authentication specifications are very mature and many implementations already exist today. Most platforms have already added support for it, and companies have deployed passwordless FIDO authentication on large scale across the globe. With this, I was asked already, are we done with FIDO? Is it time to move on? But reality is we just got started. We have the foundation, the FIDO and web authentication specifications, and the foundation in the platforms, in all major platforms supporting those specifications today. And now we focus on integrating FIDO into even more use cases and on helping people outside the core authentication industry to understand it and to deploy it. With Knock Knock, we help many large organizations to successfully deploy passwordless authentication at scale and to manage their deployments efficiently. When talking to people outside the core authentication industry, I often realize how deeply the legacy authentication methods are still impacting the way we even think about security and authentication. Very often when I talk about strong customer authentication, people immediately think two-step verification, and more specifically, typically passwords plus SMS OTPs. With all the recent successful phishing attacks, realizing there is a need for even more security scares them. OTPs already lead to significant cart abandonment. Adding yet another layer on top of OTPs could only make things worse, in their opinion. But with FIDO-based authentication, strong customer authentication can be implemented in a single convenient step. So we need to unlearn some legacy to fully embrace these new capabilities. We need to unlearn that SCA, strong customer authentication, requires two-step verification. And instead, we need to learn that there are practical solutions to do SCA in a single step. In other words, we need to learn that SCA doesn't require two steps anymore. If you think that's true, this also means there is no advantage for using weak password-based authentication for some solutions, such as cloud storage, access, or webmailer, and using a different strong authentication method only for regulated services like banking or payments. This new authentication method is stronger than legacy two-factor solutions, and it is more convenient than legacy passwords. So users want to use it consistently. Another example, when mentioning that this new authentication method supports biometrics, people often ask, what is the best biometric? And when will all devices be shipped with related sensors? Background is that we are used to requiring a single authentication gesture for all, the password, or the password and SMS OTP, potentially with the option to use hardware OTP tokens. We are used to ask all users to use the same gesture, the same payment or banking related authentication method. So that is what people implicitly attempt with biometrics. Use them only for use cases that are regulated to use strong authentication, where other use cases would continue using the legacy methods, and trying to find the single best method they will then use for all users. But there is no single best biometric solution. And there are even users that don't want to use any biometrics at all. And that is okay. So the second thing we need to unlearn is that authentication is only practical if we ask all users to use the same gesture. With FIDO authentication, we have separated the user gesture from the authentication protocol, meaning the authenticator could implement almost any user gesture for user verification, and the authentication method and the underlying infrastructure wouldn't be impacted. Additionally, the security level wouldn't be impacted either, at least not significantly. With any user verification method, the security level still is significantly better than passwords plus OTPs. Meaning it's not about finding the best biometric. It's about respecting user preferences for their preferred authentication gesture. Some like fingerprints, others like face recognition, and the next prefers to remember a single device-specific PIN, as opposed to one password per account that is stored on the server and might be phished. And it is interesting to see that in such case, users often don't even count this authentication gesture as a step in the journey. Meaning now we have all the tools available to make authentication strong and very convenient at the same time. But to fully internalize the impact of this new authentication approach, we need to unlearn some things we took for granted in the past, but they are not longer true. We have covered general authentication and online payment fraud. Let's look into the e-commerce merchant side. Merchants want to pre-fill shipping address and payment credentials in order to make checkout more convenient. This only works if the user has an account. And we know that logged-in users generate a 10% higher average order value than guest users. How the merchants authenticate their customers is not tightly regulated. Today, most merchants rely on passwords. They ask the user to provide a new password when creating the account and to enter the password at checkout. But this has an impact on account creation. Back in 2012, there was a survey stating that 38% of users would rather clean a toilet than providing a new username or password. Nowadays, some browsers would generate the password on behalf of the user, but still, asking for a password adds unnecessary friction. We know that on smartphones, users are more likely to use guest checkout, meaning many users are not willing to enter their password on a small touchscreen display. And that might be the users that originally had their desktop browser generate the password or even created their password differently. Additionally, payments need to be authenticated too. And this authentication is subject to regulation, known as a Payment Services Directive 2 in the EU. With so many people focusing on maximizing exemptions rather than making strong authentication more convenient, this often leads to unpredictable user journeys. Which user would know whether transaction risk analysis is used or not? And if yes, what bucket the transaction relates to? Or more specifically, whether a purchase of 50, 100, 150, 250 or 500 euro would trigger the need for strong customer authentication. As a customer, I would prefer to use the same convenient authentication gesture consistently for all purchases. So I feel that I am in control, but don't feel penalized with friction. And ideally, using the same gesture that I'm also using for other services as well. So I know that it will work for me and how it will work. So here's room for us to improve the user experience. This could look as follows. In the checkout flow from my merchant's webpage to just use my finger or my face or alternative PIN to authenticate the payment to my card issuer. All three examples you see use the same underlying FIDO authentication infrastructure, but in different ways. The example at the left is already practical on many platforms. It triggers authentication in an iframe. The example in the center is called delegated authentication. It avoids double authentication by delegating the authentication to the merchant. And the example at the right is still an early prototype called secure payment confirmation. Knock Knock and other players are working in and with multiple different groups to bring more secure and more convenient authentication to even more use cases. In the case of e-commerce and payments, EMVCo, W3C, and FIDO are collaborating. We are at the beginning of transforming the way authentication is done. The wholesale upgrade of the fabric of identity and authentication has just begun. Let's continue our collaboration and make it happen. I'm so excited to be part of this organization and really glad to be kicking off this conference for you all today. And I look forward to seeing what everyone comes up with on unlocking this new digital future. Thank you.